service for too much hacking. So I had to tell my mom, and she's like, okay, why don't we have AOL anymore? I'm like, oh, I didn't cover my tracks well enough. So, but what I do now with training is that I work with end users to help them see all these different kinds of security loopholes, how to protect themselves and stay safe. So using those powers for good. That's where I'm working now. And as I was developing this talk, I wanted to really dig in and think, when was it that I learned how to be good at communicating? Like, where did that really come from? And I can trace it back to when I was a student in university. I took a number of courses in linguistics, which is the science of language. And with linguistics, what was very fascinating for me was seeing that there's so many things that we do in the language that we use every single day that have rules and patterns, but we do these things without thinking about them. One of the scholars that I studied was someone named Ferdinand de Saussure. He was a Swiss linguist who lived in the early 20th century, and he wrote about this idea of structuralism. He's considered to be the father of modern linguistics and also the father of structuralism. And so when it comes to structuralism, the way that you can think about this is that there's all these different pieces that go into the large entity of language. And particularly with the way that Ferdinand de Saussure looked at this, he says, a language is a system in which all the elements fit together and in which the value of any one element depends on the simultaneous coexistence of all the others. If you're looking at this and wondering, okay, what is this guy talking about? Don't worry, I'll break it down for you. What he's saying is that if you think about this concept of language, it's this very large entity. Among this large entity of language, you can break it down into lots of smaller pieces. And all of these smaller pieces are connected to each other. It's a relational thing. So when we think about the way that we communicate with each other, it's not that we're saying communication is one thing. Rather, there are all these smaller pieces that go into it that allow the language to function. And it's through this lens that we're going to learn how to become better at communication. Because when you want to become better at something, you don't say, I'm doing this as a whole piece. Rather, you try to break it down into the smaller pieces, problem solve, and that's exactly what Ferdinand de Saussure is talking about with structural linguistics. So I'm thinking about this, and his theory reminds me a lot of building with Legos, or Lego bricks. A friend of mine corrected me on that. He's like, Olivia, do not get up there and say Legos. Any Lego people in here? I know there's some, apparently terminology. Yeah, it's Lego bricks, right? Not Legos? Thank you. Okay, so when you're building with Lego, what? Oh, Lego. Oh, goodness. Okay. Thank you. So see, I'm becoming a better communicator right now. Thank you. So when you're building with Lego, that's it. Okay, wow, that I got it, thank you. The idea here is that suppose you have a single Lego in your hand and you're trying to build something with that. The way that you make that decision is based in part on what came before, so what's already in front of you with the structure, and also in part on where you're looking for that piece to go next. So that's the relational aspect here. It makes the decision about not just where you put that next Lego, but also how you place it, how you orient it. That's exactly how language and communication work. So as we're diving into this, I really want to stress that when we're thinking of becoming better communicators, really concentrate on how all these different pieces fit together. So here is our agenda for today. We're going to start with some best practices for explaining technical concepts in non-technical terms. This is also where we're going to jump into active listening and empathy. As I was developing this talk, at first I had one section on empathy, but I realized empathy is one of those concepts that truly runs throughout this entire talk. So if you hear me talk about empathy a lot, it's because it really is at that foundation of improving your communication. Then we'll discuss how you can adjust your communication approach for different communication styles, and wrap up with using some problem-solving skills to help you get unstuck during some difficult conversations. Okay. So with this talk being called Think Like a Trainer, I want you to get into my mindset right now so that you can understand how I do the work that I do, and even as I'm thinking about this as a training session right now. To give you some more context about the work that I do as a technical trainer, I train people through virtual webinars, I train people in person, I train in small conference rooms, I train in large lecture halls, anywhere from one person at a time to a small group, up to about 100, if not more. So you name it, I've trained in that approach. Regardless of the size of the room, regardless of if it's over a webinar or in a room like this, every single time that I'm about to train people and communicate with them, I always start by thinking about what brought them to these chairs. Why are they here? That was how I approached building this presentation here. Thinking about, you all made a choice to be here, and what's bringing you to this room? What are you looking to get out of this? And I know it may seem a little bit silly to think that you need to do this every time that you communicate with someone, but I guarantee that if you take even just a couple of seconds to ask yourself, this person that I'm communicating with right now, what are they looking to get out of the conversation? What's in it for them? This is the foundation of empathy, because it helps you to understand what you can do to help them and really start to see things from their perspective. Often people say empathy refers to where are they coming from, in the sense of where are they coming from in terms of their opinion. But honestly, when I think about where they're coming from, I think where are they literally coming from? You all just came from lunch. I had to factor that into the way that I'm presenting right now. Because when I'm communicating with people and I know, suppose it's first thing in the morning, there is a really bad commute, I need to adjust myself to reflect that. If it is at the end of a very long day, and when I ask people, how are you doing? I don't just say that as filler. I do it really to get that information about how was your day? One time I was training a group of people and I didn't realize that they had been in like 5 or 6 meetings that entire day, and I was meeting number 7 and there were still 3 more to go. So knowing that, it helped me to understand that I really needed to do some things to ensure that I was responding to them in the way that they needed it most. And that really comes into play when you're doing things like explaining technical concepts in non-technical terms, because that can be an area where you can get particularly stuck and not quite know how to respond to it if you remove yourself too much from this idea of where other people are coming from. So to get started with this, how many of you struggle with explaining technical concepts in non-technical terms? Most of us? Okay, great. Me too. It's something, even as a trainer, I still am always evolving with this. As I learn new things, I need to adjust to reflect that. As I was developing this talk, I really sat down with myself to ask, okay, explaining technical things in non-technical terms can be very hard, but why? And I realized that part of it comes from not that I don't understand the technical part of it, it's quite the opposite. It's usually that I know it so well that I have a tendency to over-explain and want to keep talking more about something when the other person's just like, you can stop talking now, please stop. So by another show of hands, how many of you have also dealt with over-explaining? Like when you're trying to tell someone, you're just like, I want to tell you every single thing about this code. Okay, great, excellent. For those of you who may be on the opposite side of this, that your particular concern is that you struggle with needing to find the words to even get started with explaining, in this section, I'm also going to include some content about how to develop metaphors. So be on the lookout for that. We're going to start with 6 strategies I recommend for cutting down on the over-explaining. And then I'll also show you an example of how I do this in my work as a trainer. So here's a few things that you're going to want to avoid when you're explaining technical concepts. One is going to be any assumptions of people's prior knowledge or skill level, because you never know where they're coming in from. That can look like saying things along the lines of, oh, as I'm sure you already know. I mean, I've been on the receiving end of this, sitting in a room where someone opened with, oh, as I'm sure you already know, XYZ. And I'm sitting there thinking, wait, I don't know. Am I in the wrong here? And that for me mentally, when I heard that, it made me kind of shut down, and that never went away for the rest of that session because I felt that I was lacking some kind of foundational knowledge, and I was too afraid to ask for help because I thought that I was possibly the only person in the room who didn't know what was going on. You also want to avoid using words like just, simply, or obviously when you're explaining processes in particular. So if you're walking someone through something, please try to avoid these and saying things like, oh, you simply do this, or you just click that, because what is simple for one person could very well be the most difficult thing for someone else, and you just never know that. So avoiding those things, focusing more on the process without giving it a kind of qualifying word like this as to how easy or difficult you assume that it might be for someone else. Also, I recommend avoiding dismissive corrections, which can usually look like everyone's favorite phrase, well, actually. That is, if anyone's ever been on the receiving end of a well, actually, it's not a good place to be in, because what that indicates is that if someone is making a statement, like an end user, for example, and then you need to correct them by saying, well, actually, that dismisses what they contributed to the conversation, and it shuts them down and makes them think, oh, I was completely wrong, so I don't feel like I ever want to say anything else here. To give you an example of how I see this a lot in my work, at Cloud Bakers, we do a lot of G Suite migrations. So you have companies who are switching into G Suite from another platform, say Outlook, and there are users who start spreading rumors amongst themselves, because change can be really hard, so it's easy for rumors to start flaring. Oftentimes people will say, oh, I heard that now that our company is getting G Suite for work, that means they're going to have access to all of our personal Gmail accounts, and they can read all of our emails, and then they're scared. So in the middle of a training session, someone will bring that up to me and say, yeah, Olivia, I know that this company is going to have access to my personal emails now. So think about that statement that I just made. How do you think that person would take it if I started my response with, well, actually, that's not true? That's just shutting them down. So the way that I would handle that, first, I would acknowledge their contribution. I would say something like, oh, thank you so much for bringing this up. That's a really good point about data privacy or something like that. I would make it kind of general, and then say, to clarify what you brought up, G Suite is completely separate from personal Gmail. And then I would cycle back around to saying, thanks again for bringing this up, because as a whole, you always want to be concerned about data protection and security, something of that nature. So do you see the difference between that approach and the, well, actually? Very slight difference, but what you want to do when you're explaining these things, and also when you're making corrections, is to do so in a way that gives people the right information, but also encourages them to keep coming back to you for times when they may need other points of assistance. The last part here would be, you want to avoid any kind of unnecessary technical jargon or acronyms. This really comes into play for times when there are end users who are completely unfamiliar with the systems that you're using. And there are words and acronyms that we use all the time in technical work that they just don't know. So as much as possible, if you're able to cut down on that, please do, because it means that you're able to bring them into the conversation and not make them feel like there's something out there that they should know, but they don't. Okay. And I'll also be sharing these slides on my Twitter, so if there's anything on here that you're like, I want to see that again, I'll be posting them on there. So at Oli Ravi, for those of you who just joined in, you'll be able to find me there. So on the other side, here's what you can do instead. First, I recommend using sequence adverbs as a way to demonstrate processes. And sequence adverbs are words like first, next, then, finally. Especially if you're explaining something that is process-oriented, using these types of words when you're listing out the steps is very helpful, because it keeps you on track as the person who's doing the explaining, and it also lets the person on the receiving end know that it lets them know where you are in that process, so that they're not getting lost and thinking, okay, wait, what are we doing here? Also use shorter sentences. I have a tendency to ramble sometimes if I get really excited about what I'm talking about, and it could be a super long sentence with like commas and semicolons, and I'm just talking and talking and talking. And I put this in here because often people will say a best practice for explaining technical things in non-technical terms is to explain it like you're talking to a 5-year-old. I personally don't like that approach, because I think of that as dumbing down what I'm saying. And I don't like to dumb down what I say when I talk to end users. Rather, the approach that I take is more for myself, to use shorter sentences. Now, with balance, it's not like I'm going to say, this is email, you log in, there you go. Like don't do something like that. But on the other hand, what you do want to try to do more of is make sure that you are chunking it into smaller pieces, and that gives the other person some time to really absorb what it is that you're explaining to them. Also, check for understanding. This is a technique that came out of my student teaching program. Prior to teaching in Chicago public schools, I'd never heard of this concept before. But it's what consists of asking questions like, does that make sense? What can I further clarify for you? It is absolutely okay to ask these things, and I really do encourage you to. Asking these questions does not take away from what you know as the subject matter expert. Rather, it's your way of periodically checking in with the other person to say, all right, now that I've given you some information, let me know. How are you feeling about this? Does that make sense? And asking, what can I further clarify for you? That goes a little bit further than a straightforward yes, no. Because rather than them saying yes or no, you're opening up the door for a bigger answer, for them to know that it's okay to ask about a specific thing. So again, what can I further clarify for you is going to be a good way to check for that understanding and continue to educate them as needed. So for the next part here, I wanted to give you a really tangible example of how I do all of this in my work as a technical trainer. And the part that I mentioned about over-explaining, I really want to show you like how that looks for me. So I thought about what is something I'm really excited about so that you can see that excitement and see me try to balance against that. And there is a security training course that I'm in the process of developing for end users to teach them all about not just what to avoid when it comes to phishing and hacking attempts, but to really show them what it looks like from the other perspective. So what I'm working on looks like this. Are any of you familiar with Kali Linux? Anyone? A couple of you? Yay, Linux. All right. So in this case, what I'm going to do is imagine that all of you are my customers that I'm speaking with right now. So maybe the main point of contact that I'm speaking with at a company to help them understand what is going on here. Honestly, right now, I really want to tell you all about how this works, because if you've never seen this before, this is really cool. But I'm not going to do that because I have to remind myself the purpose of this is not for me to tell you all the ins and outs of Kali Linux, but to remind myself of what brought you to these chairs. And in this scenario, what's bringing the people to these chairs is knowing that they need to understand how this relates to training their end users. So here's an example of how I would do this, probably by using some of those sequence adverbs and also shorter sentences. So based on this, I would say something to my client like, this is an example of how we can illustrate a phishing attack for end users. We feel that it's important for end users to understand what a phishing attack looks like from the hacker's perspective. So first, on the right, you'll see a Google phishing page that the hacker has created that looks exactly like a real Google login page. The end user will enter their credentials, and then they'll click sign in. Next, on the left, you'll see that the attacker will immediately capture the user's email and password. Finally, by the time that this information has been given to the hacker, it's too late for the end user and their credentials have been compromised. Okay, that was really hard for me right now. That, honestly, it really was, because this is a good example of how I know so much more about this. And I feel that at times when I'm explaining technical things in non-technical ways, it's holding me back from really wanting to share all the ins and outs there. But by a show of hands, how many of you now understand what this is doing based on what I just described? Yeah, excellent. Yay, I did something. So here, it's okay to sometimes scale it back. And the way that I did that was by reminding myself of what you, as the end user, need to know from your lens. And notice I avoided any kind of technical jargon. I didn't even name it. I didn't say, this is Kali Linux. I didn't talk about, this is the social engineering toolkit, the credential harvesting tool. I'm using port 80. This is port forwarding. I didn't say any of those things because they don't need to know those things. And so when you do that, you're really making it understandable for people on the other side. Now, from that point, there may be times when some further questions come up. And that's where we're going to transition into a little bit more of active listening. Now, within active listening, there's a whole lot that goes into it. I've given a talk recently about mentoring and best practices for that, and active listening is a piece of that. From that talk, I've pulled out paraphrasing and clarifying as two of the most essential tools that you'll want to use as you are improving your empathy skills and becoming better at listening. There's a quick story I want to tell you about this. The way that I first became aware of the concept of active listening really was back when I was in university. The same linguistics course I mentioned earlier, I had a professor who was just very dynamic, just an amazing teaching presence, and really made all of us students feel warm and welcome in his class, even though there were about 100 to 150 of us in this class every week. So in a class of 100 to 150, he would lecture. There would be some times when people would raise hands to share their thoughts. And I noticed that when someone would raise their hand to speak, my professor would then call on them and say, all right, before you share what you want to say, what did the person before you just say? The very first time that happened, I thought, oh, that's a good question. And it was not me that he called on that time, but I had to kind of check myself and think, could I answer that question, honestly? Because how many of you often do it where when you're having a conversation with someone, you are thinking more about what you want to say next than what the other person in front of you is saying right now? I've been doing that sometimes today too, and I'm like, I'm talking about communication. I need to stop doing this stuff. And it's okay, no one's perfect. But when you recognize that within yourself, that's where active listening comes in. And the lesson I took away from that professor, he really instilled in us the value of active listening is being part of a community of learners. Because he would say to us, if you are not prepared to be able to answer that question of what the person before you just said, then you're not ready to share something else with the class. You can't just share without being able to take that back in. So here's how you can get started with paraphrasing and clarifying. It's part of active listening. First, you want to, see, I just did that. The first, I'm doing the things I just told you to do. Okay. One way is, what I hear you saying is, so you're putting this in your own words. You might also say, as I understand it, you're having difficulty with X, Y, Z. Or for clarifying, you might ask them, can you tell me more about this? I really recommend the use of clarifying as a way to get understanding when you have no idea what someone is asking you about. There are times I get some really vague questions and I just don't know what they're asking. They're like, I can't do this thing. I'm like, okay, what thing? Can you tell me more about what you've tried? Can you tell me more about where you're getting stuck? Help me out with that. And it does help because then they're giving me more details and I'm able to assist them further in that regard. But one watch point that I do want to make sure you're aware of when it comes to clarifying, this is one that you definitely want to use in moderation. So let's say you're in a conversation with someone, you're trying to explain something to them, and you need to enter into the clarifying phase. I would recommend only ask about 2 clarifying questions at a time before you continue on. Because if you were to ask about any more than that, like if you ask 3, 4, 5 clarifying questions in a row, like, can you tell me more about this? Well, what did you do next? Okay, is it like this other thing there? You see that as you problem solving, but the person on the other end can see that as you either stalling for time or also you're asking so many questions because you don't know what you're talking about. And it's not to say that you don't, but the balance there that I recommend is ask about 2 clarifying questions, and then from the new information that they've given you, then give them an answer back. So it's kind of like a give and take, that you ask some, they give you some more information, and then you clarify over time. Okay. Another strategy is to make some relevant comparisons. And this is what I mentioned for those of you who find that you may struggle with even starting to come up with the words for explaining certain things. You can use some metaphors and analogies that the other person can relate to. Usually as a best practice, I personally avoid the use of sports analogies and metaphors just because I know that many people are not into sports. Probably not the sports that I'm into. My favorite sport to follow is figure skating. So if I'm making metaphors about like, this is like a triple axel, people are gonna look at me like, what are you talking about? Like, what is this? And I'm just confusing them. Also in a room, I've seen it where if someone makes a sports comparison and then the other people are just like, I don't get that, they just shut down and think, there's nothing in this for me. So I will have some examples of what you can draw from if you're not sure where to begin with this. I also recommend that you shouldn't linger on that metaphor for too long. And I have a tendency to do this too when I have a metaphor that's really good and I just want to keep talking about it. I might say, oh, this process is like this. And I just keep making the metaphor bigger and bigger. And before I know it, I'm talking more about the metaphor than the actual technical concept that I was there to explain in the beginning. So you want to get in with the analogy or metaphor, make your point, and then go back to what I mentioned earlier about remembering the people who are in those seats. look to see cues like people nodding heads. So as soon as you start to see those very subtle cues, that's when you can think, all right, they're starting to make a connection with this. That's my go ahead to ramp back from the metaphor and then go back into the tech. And also have a few go-to examples that you can feel ready to use, especially if making these metaphors can be quite difficult for you. And practice them. Have some friends and colleagues that you can use as sounding boards to say, hey, coworker, I'm trying to work on improving my communication. Do you mind if I test out a few of these with you and you let me know what you think? That's what my wife does for me. I make metaphors all the time, and if she makes a face like, I know, let me not use that one in a training. Or also when I'm practicing giving my talks, and if I'm like rambling, she'll give a face like, and then I know to stop. So practice and have a few people that you trust that you can lean on for that. So I want to give you some really actionable strategies for this, and one way that you can really connect with people is through food. So thinking about what people can relate to and understand, you really can't go wrong with food when it comes to making some comparisons, right? So if you're working on a project or an application where you want to explain it to that person, not all food is the same, so you want to ensure that the food example you're using is technically like a good match. So if it's something that has multiple layers, guess what also has multiple layers? A sandwich or lasagna too. I totally do it in trainings where I can see if someone has come from lunch and I can tell that they're really in that happy food, I just ate food phase, like I totally bring out the food metaphors. And I'll say, hey, you know that sandwich you just ate for lunch right now? Yeah, it's like this technical thing. So we're in the pastrami phase right now. We're in the middle, something like that. You can also think about if there are times when there are many options to consider. I don't know if any of you have ever worked with clients who just want all the options all at once. Any of you? Like you're working with that and they're like, just give me everything. Yeah. So then that's when I refer to the buffet. So with the buffet, I'll say something like, you know, with this project, think of it like a buffet. First time you go into the buffet, you take the look around and you see all the different food that's there. You don't bring every single food back with you from the first trip, do you? And then there's always the one person who's like, yeah, I do. So then I'm like, okay, let me switch this up. But for the most part, I can use that, and then people understand, like, oh, and then I'll reinforce it a little bit more to say, you sit back down, you eat, and sometimes the food that you took from the buffet was not the best, so then you know what to avoid moving forward. And then when you're ready, you go back to the buffet again, and you get some more things there. So it's really reassuring in that sense, because people can relate. They're like, I left the steak at the buffet, but it's still there for me. I can go back to it when I need to. And lastly, another one is different stages of production. So you might have a cake metaphor. If you have some ingredients that then becomes batter, that then becomes a cake. You can tell that I was probably really hungry as I was making these slides. But when I'm thinking about this as a process, I can help people understand that there's a timeline that we're working on here. I know you want us to be at the cake phase right now, but we're still mixing the batter. We're going to get there, but it's going to take a little bit longer. So have a few go-to examples. And probably the best metaphor that I've ever made was probably one that I did a few months ago. I was at a client site, one of our customers. They are end users who work in the dairy farming business. So they have a lot of cows. And as I was training them on Google Sheets, including how to filter data and use pivot tables. So I'm thinking, how can I really explain this to them, knowing that they're probably going to have a question about what's the difference between filtering data manually and filtering it through a pivot table, because you can kind of get to the same eventual outcome, but taking a different means. And I had an aha moment. I realized, and this is the metaphor I gave them, or the analogy, I said, working with data it's like the cows that you work with. Just like there's more than one way to milk a cow, there's more than one way to filter your data. And they got it instantly, because they realized that one guy said, yeah, it's like if you are doing a milking machine, that's like the pivot table that does a lot of that automation for you, as opposed to you can still milk a cow by hand. It's going to take a little longer, but you can fine tune it just like you would with regular filtering. And they loved that. That was that big aha moment for them because of the particular industry that they work in. Now, would I use that same analogy when I train people in a hospital? No. I mean, can you imagine what would happen if I go into a hospital and start training people and say, all right, y'all, we're going to learn about pivot tables today. Did you know there's more than one way to milk a cow and data? And I'm not going to do that. So think about the context of this and really make it connect to the people that you're speaking with. So now we're going to talk about the next piece of this language puzzle here, which is to break it out and adjust communication for different styles. And I'll tell you, as I was doing research for this particular section of this talk, I came across a lot of differing opinions on this. If you ever do a Google search for communication styles, everyone has a different opinion as to how many communication styles exist. Some people say there are 4, some say 5. I think I found one site that said there's like 10. So take it with a grain of salt, if you will. But I also wanted to separate this out from the idea that many researchers have, that people have a fixed communication style. Like they'll put you in a certain bucket and say, you're always this type of communicator, or you're always that type of communicator. So here's the takeaway that I want you to get from this particular piece of this. A communication style is not something that you are fixed into, or that anyone else is fixed into. It is very much context specific. You may have people who communicate in one way when they are working on one type of project that can be confusing for them, and they have a completely different kind of communication style when they're doing something that comes more easily to them. So keep that in mind as we're going through this next section, because you'll see how we'll talk about different communication styles and how those can vary. So the ones that I decided to settle on for this were the assertive communication style, the passive communication style. Can anyone guess what the last one is? Who said it? Aggressive, yes. So, and yes, the aggressive style. So I laugh every time I see this emoji, but passive, assertive, and aggressive. Again, thinking about how it's not something that's fixed, it's very much context specific. So now we're going to talk about how you can recognize these different communication styles in the people that you're talking to, and knowing how you can respond accordingly to them. As a trainer, this is something that I have to do all the time, because as I'm training people, if I see that there's someone who's coming across with a more passive style, I need to adjust accordingly. It's essentially a way of them sending me a certain signal about not necessarily the what they're saying, but how they're saying it. And if they're sending me a certain signal and I'm responding back to it with a signal that does not match that, that's how confusion may happen. So we'll start with the assertive communication style. Assertive characteristics can be someone who has a confident type of posture. If they are looking attentive, all of you are looking attentive, so thank you for that. They usually will have an enthusiastic tone of voice. And there are also some verbal cues that can go along with this too. You'll tend to know that you're speaking with someone who is more of the assertive style if they say things like, I believe we should. So rather than what we'll see in a moment for aggressive, which is like, we need to do this now. It's like, yeah, I think I have an opinion about something, but I'm going to say it more in the context of, I believe. Also, what alternatives do we have? People who have an assertive communication style are very open to alternatives, and not just open to alternatives, but they also are able to express that rather than something like more the passive style, afraid to speak up sometimes. And in my opinion, this again is really compared to the aggressive style. It's like, it's not my opinion, it's my way or the highway. Now for the assertive style, I think that learning how to respond to this particular type is going to be most helpful for those of you who tend to have a more passive communication style yourself. Because let's say you're someone who tends to be more on the passive side, and you're faced with someone who is more assertive. How's that going to go? One of the great things about this combination here and what you can do in response to that is that you can mirror their body language. So like I'm standing here and like standing up and looking confident. If you're someone who's feeling more passive, mirroring that person's body language will have the effect of actually bringing your confidence up a bit more too. And when I say mirror, it doesn't mean you have to like actually mirror everything they do. So like if they step to the right, you don't need to step to the right. If they put their hand on the hip, don't do that, because it's not like a waltz. It's just, you're trying to really match them, but you know. Also, show confidence and openness. I say this because earlier in my career, I was very much someone who tended to have a lot more passive communication. About 10 years ago, the idea of even getting up on a stage would have terrified me. I would not have been that person, probably even attending a conference. And so at that time, when I was someone who was more passive with my communication, when I had friends who were more assertive and more confident, that was good inspiration for me, because it helped me to see how I could be more assertive. And not saying that I was like dominating the conversation or something, but I just felt a lot more sure of myself, and showing that confidence and openness for collaboration really can help you in that regard. And in terms of really making a connection with people who come across as assertive, use words like we, our, and us to emphasize that you're connecting with them and you're open for collaboration. Because what I mentioned on the earlier slide, with people who are assertive with communication, they want to be a team player. They are a team player. And you really want to make sure that you take advantage of that to say, yes, I think that this is a good plan for us. We should do this. Whereas the aggressive style, you'll see that in just a moment, is a little bit different. So let's shift over to passive communication. We'll talk about how it looks and how it sounds. Passive communication, someone may be speaking in more of a low volume, and they often won't want to be heard. Uptalk. Are you all familiar with this term, uptalk? Okay. This is something where, when I was rehearsing this for the last time last night, as I did this, it was hard for me to come out of this. So if I keep doing this after I explain this, please give me a signal, because I don't want to annoy you for longer than I have to with this. Uptalk refers to when you go up at the end of your sentences, almost like you're asking a question, and it sounds like you don't know what you're talking about. Do you know? Well, that's okay. See, okay, let me stop. Woo, okay, I don't do that. So it's but typically when you hear that, it's indicative of someone who is in more of a passive communication style, because they are saying something that is a statement, they're declaring it, but that lift at the end of their statement is an indicator to you that they are not fully sure and confident about what they're saying. So when you hear that, that's a sign for you. Also, a slumping posture. Not always, someone may just have a bad back, but if you have this in conjunction with some of these other things, and avoiding eye contact, that's another thing to look out for. Someone who's more passive may not want to directly engage with you there. Verbal cues for passive communication could be when people say things like, this is probably wrong, but in a training, I often will have end users who want to share something, and they will end up being completely right about what they wanted to say. But I notice they preface it with, well, this is probably wrong, but blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, you were right on that. And part of what I like to do in my role is really encourage people so that moving forward, they are less likely to start their statements with, this is probably wrong, but. I know it can be difficult to come across as, no one wants to be wrong. So, but it's okay to make a statement without preceding it with that. When it comes to things like wanting to collaborate, people who are communicating in a passive way might say, I guess we could, as opposed to, I believe we could. There's a difference. And then they may take away from what they're saying by ending a statement with, but only if that's okay with you. Suppose someone brings up an idea at your next stand-up meeting, and you're asking them, hey, what do you think that we should do next? They might say, I think we should do this, but only if that's okay with you. It's really hard. I've coached people on this to say, make your statement, and then cut it off right there. It's so hard to pull away from that. But in terms of recognizing these signs, this is what you want to look out for when you are communicating with someone. And I want to share a story with you about this. You know, the part that I mentioned about how communication styles are not something that you're fixed into, but they're context specific. A few months ago, I did a training at a customer site where I was there for, I think it was about 2.5 days of on-site training, about 4 trainings a day, and I was away from home, so it was just very long days. And whenever I go to a company as a visitor, it's always a little bit nerve-wracking for me at first because I don't know anyone there. I don't know my way around the building. And I feel very fortunate when I happen to come across someone there who takes me under their wing and helps me to see the lay of the land. So this particular company, there was a woman who was one of the executive administrative assistants. From my very first minute there, she welcomed me with open arms and she gave me a tour of the office. She showed me where I would be setting up. She asked me if there was anything I needed. She even showed me the snack room, and from there we were best friends because she knew where the secret snacks were stashed. And then as I was finally getting settled in a bit more, she even showed me her notepad where she had written out all of her questions she had that she wanted to bring up during the training. So all this so far, what communication style does that sound like to you? Assertive, right. So she was confident, she was ready to go, and I was so excited to have her in my group training session. So fast forward to the actual training, and then it's a room of about 15 people there. And I noticed as the training went on, and I'm asking, does anyone have questions? And people will ask questions at other points too. She wasn't asking anything. She still had her notepad out in front of her, but her posture had changed. She wasn't saying anything at all. She was even avoiding eye contact with not just me, but everyone there. She was like slumped in, looking down, just being there. And I realized as I looked around the room that something had changed, because whereas before, when it was just me and her, she was in the assertive style. It was more comfortable for her. But then in that room, looking around, everyone else was way more senior to her in role. So suddenly now, in that context, she had gone into a more passive communication style. And this is why I mean that if I had the mindset of, oh, I see that she's assertive, so that's how she's always going to be, in a time when she was slipping into being more passive, I needed to recognize that and make sure that I wasn't sending her a kind of communication signal that wasn't matching where she was in that moment. And so what I decided to do were all the things that you see here, how to respond to this. So I use positive body language. That means that I don't stand with my hands on my hips or like with my arms folded like this, like I'm mean and staring at you. Like being as open as I could with her in that regard. And also smiling at her too. And not in like a creepy, like smiling way, but like a genuine, I'm here for you kind of way thing. I also decided that I didn't want to put her on the spot in that training. So after I wrapped up and the rest of the group went out, I wanted to still acknowledge her contributions. I said to her, hey, thanks again for all your help today, and I really appreciate how prepared you came with your list of questions. I know you didn't have time to ask them during the session just now, so do you want to sit down together and go over them right now? She looked like she was about to cry, but in a good way, you know? Because in that moment, I could tell that she had felt a shift. Like when she was showing me around the office, she was the one who was in a role of a certain type of leadership. But yet when the leadership team was in the room, she no longer felt that she could be a leader. And so in my role at that moment, it was up to me to make sure that I acknowledged what she had brought to the table. Because yes, she felt a little bit uncomfortable, but when you see these things, you're able to respond in a better way. And also, ask specific follow-up questions. When you do this, and be specific and not just say, what else do you need to know? Or do you need to know anything else? If you can make a connection back to something that they already shared before, that's going to be even better because it means that you are showing that you did all those things. You were actively listening to them. You were clarifying what you needed to know. So now let's talk about this one. Aggressive communication. I don't know why I'm talking like this now. Every time I practice this, I get into this weird voice when I talk about it, so let me not do that. With aggressive communication, you can recognize it when people have like a really loud tone of voice, when they have no reason to be that loud. If they're talking over other people and having like a really rigid posture, because there's a difference between standing confidently and standing so stiff where you can tell the person is just like mad about something. And also glaring too. I'm looking around the room and no one is glaring at me, so I think I'm doing this okay. All right. But yeah, glaring is usually another sign that someone is coming from a very angry, aggressive place. And here's how it sounds. Remember when we were talking about collaboration and saying, I believe we should, or I believe we could. The aggressive version of this is, you must do this, or I'm right, you're wrong, and it must be done this way. This is how this can all look. So another story time about this. This actually comes from the same training visit as the story that I just shared, but a different group session. So I'm in the room, another group of about 15, 20 people, and within the first 5 minutes of that particular training session, I thought everything was going great. And this one woman raised her hand and said to me, I have a question. I asked her, sure, what's your question? And she says, I just need to tell you that I don't understand anything that you're talking about right now. None of this is making sense, and you are doing a horrible job with this training. And my first reaction was, I thought, wait, that's not a question. So like, this is what I'm thinking. And so I'm like, but then she keeps talking. So I'm like, okay. So then she says, yeah, you're doing a horrible job with this. I don't know where you're coming from. And then she starts trying to get other people in the room to agree with her. She's like, isn't she doing a bad job, everyone? Who agrees with me? My heart's racing as I'm telling this story right now. Because honestly, in that moment, I really wanted to cry. As I mentioned, I had been at this site for about 2.5 days. I was away from home. And it's really difficult when you're away. I mean, there I was just about a 2-hour flight from home, not like now where it's 8 hours, but it's still, there's this kind of thing where the personal side kicks in. And when something like that happens, you kind of just want to retreat to a nice, happy place. So I'm thinking, wow, she's really coming across as aggressive. I wanted to cry. I wanted to run out of the room. But I also went back and thought about who's sitting in these chairs right now. Why is she here? She does not know me. She only met me 5 minutes ago. So what she's saying to me right now, I guarantee it has nothing to do with me as a person. But I know it's so hard in that moment. But what I had to do was respond by staying calm and pausing. This is also something that I used to do with my students that I taught, because teenagers often will have conflicts with each other, and I would encourage them, when someone says something to you that's hurtful, take a couple seconds to pause before you say something back. And I guarantee you're probably going to make a better choice than you would have otherwise. I also depersonalize the situation, remembering it is not about me. Change is hard for many people. I mean, I work with users who have been on Outlook for like 20-something years, and when they find out that Outlook is going away and they're switching over to Gmail, you would think I've given them the worst news in the world. So some of them can take that out in ways that are not necessarily the best, and I knew from experience that this is where that was coming from. And so I empathized with her. I tried to put myself in a situation where something had changed for me that was hard, and I can relate to that. Now, granted, I didn't call somebody out in a training like that, but it's still, I can understand why she was saying those things. And I focused on being more proactive, like making the choice to focus on developing a solution rather than being reactive. And in this scenario, after I stayed calm, after I took a couple minutes to breathe, I said to her, thank you for being here in the session, because I know that this change is going to be, I can tell that this change is really hard for you. I want to reassure you that I'm here to help you. And as we go throughout the session, if you have specific points that I can explain for you, please let me know, because I want to work together with you. So all these kinds of things. That was the most difficult moment of my training career thus far. But by breaking it down into pieces and remembering that language is very complex, that's what helped me to get out of it. So in the last part of this talk, the last piece of our language bubble here, we're going to discuss how you can use problem-solving skills to help you get unstuck. Now, all of us here in this room, we have some type of technical skill set. And whenever you're doing technical work, chances are you're going to get into a situation where you need to problem solve. How many of you have a kind of problem-solving methodology that you tend to refer to when you get stuck? You have? Okay, great. So you have a certain workflow that you go through. And that's what I want to really encourage you to do when you're in a tough situation. That it can be hard to get out of that situation, but what you want to do is remind yourself that just as we're talking about language being broken down into smaller pieces, the way that you problem solve can also help you to break that down into pieces. So first, if there's a statement that someone says, you're in a meeting where you're trying to explain something, or your manager says something to you, you're just like, what are you talking about? First thing is to break it down and prioritize those pieces, but don't overthink it. And I'll show you an example coming up of what this looks like. I say don't overthink it because here I am giving you a methodology for problem solving in a real-time conversation. Realistically, when we're talking and communicating, you can't say to someone, oh, this is a problem. Hold on a second, I need to break this down and prioritize. Like, no, you're not gonna do that. So I try to keep this as streamlined as possible and still giving you an approach where if you try to break these down into smaller chunks, like someone saying, oh, we've got a problem with this code. Okay, we've got some problems. Now, when we break them down, which of those sticks out as the most immediate and pressing one, for example? And then what you will then do is solve them one at a time. It's often referred to as like the snowball effect, where if you start with one thing and then you solve that, then that makes it easier to start solving the other things too. And this really only comes from the approach of breaking this down into smaller pieces. Because if you try to get out of a tough situation just by looking at it as one big piece, that's when you start doing things like rambling and talking around in circles. I'll admit that I do this sometimes. Like if someone asks me a question I don't know the answer to, I will try to talk around it and talk about other things and even change the subject. My friends who know that I do this will call me out on it, but then when I look at it, I realize, yeah, I said a lot of things, but I really didn't solve anything. So we'll talk about some problem-solving strategies. I want to explain why this works, though, because when I go into a difficult communication setting and I know that I have a strategy that I can use, I feel confident. I feel like I can fix something. But on the other hand, if I ever try to revert back to how I used to communicate before, and I'm like, I don't need a strategy, I don't need any structure, here's what that looks like. So when I'm in a conversation, I kind of just want to do that. Like, if I could do that to get out of conversations, I probably would. So don't be like Homer. Instead, use some of these strategies. I want you to think of these as being like a toolkit for you. And the good news is that the first three we've already covered. So paraphrasing is a strategy for problem solving. Clarifying is also a strategy that you can use. And creating metaphors and analogies. When you're getting stuck, think of having these as a toolkit in front of you and assessing which ones make the most sense to use. The other two that I'll mention here, one is called positive framing, which is something that came from my years as a teacher, seeing positive intent in other people when they're communicating, even when they tell you in the middle of a training that you're doing a horrible job. I had to find some positivity there. I had to. In that case, I had to look at it as this is coming out of a place of concern, probably not for just her, but also her team members who are being affected by this change. So it's tough, but having positivity helps. And I'm also going to show you an empathy strategy called feel, felt, found that you can use if you find that you may have difficulty with expressing empathy through communication. So here's an example scenario for this. This needs to go back to the way it was before. Change is hard. Nope, I know you showed me this, but no, not having it. This needs to go back. So this is what a person is saying. As part of this problem-solving methodology, what you need to do is then figure out what else are they saying here? What else is being implied? Because if you only take this at surface, like surface level value, then you're only responding to that, but there are other things that are hidden inside of it. It's kind of like, okay, I'm making a metaphor, which is one of the strategies. Think of it as being like a suitcase. I say this because I have a suitcase and I'm traveling right now. If you look at this as just a suitcase, you see that it is a container. On the other hand, when you unpack it, you can see all the different clothes that are inside of it. So we want to go deeper and see all the different key pieces there. And I probably do need to pack tonight, I'm realizing that. Good reminder to myself. So this may also be implying that someone is feeling anxious. They might be thinking that this is negatively affecting other stakeholders who need to be included in this change. And they're also implying that change can be difficult for them. So step one, break it down into your smaller pieces. The next step is to think about which of these strategies will best fit for what we're talking about here. We've already discussed clarifying, so we're not going to go into that again, but I do want to explain feel, felt, found, which gives you a structure for talking about empathy. You might say, all right, change is hard. I can understand why you might feel that way. I've worked with other clients who've also felt that it would be better to go back to the previous version. So in the second piece of this, you're normalizing this. You're saying, I understand how you feel, and you're not the only one who's felt that way. And then what I found that can be helpful with adjusting is, and fill in the blanks. So feel, felt, found. And do be mindful of your tone with this. You don't want to say, for example, like, I can understand why you might feel that way, because then that just sounds kind of sarcastic and snarky. So be genuine with it and know that you can always go back to this as a structure if you need to. And when you need to be positive, like in that situation, I was thinking, yeah, no, there's no positivity in this. She is saying that I'm horrible at my job. But I had to put myself in the mindset where I could do positive framing, assuming that there was some positive intent behind her statement. So I might say that I recognize that this change affects not just you, but also your entire department. Because if she's saying something like that to me, it means that this change is really going to affect her. So by me being a better communicator, I'm showing her that even though she didn't say that, I get it. And I'm not trying to speak on her behalf, but it's another way of me connecting with her. And with this, you're really reminding yourself of what brought that person to the conversation. Empathy. We've come full circle. And now that as we're wrapping up, we're coming back to these seats. And I want to close with this again, because this is truly where you want to start and finish as you are becoming better communicators. You want to remind yourself, why is someone in front of me? What is in this for them when they're speaking? And that's going to help you orient yourself to them as you're figuring out what to say to them and how you're saying it to them. And the way that you can communicate makes such a big difference. And I know it can seem a little tough at first when you need to remind yourself, why are they here? But full disclosure, this whole talk, I've been reminding myself, something brought you all to these chairs, and I want to make sure that I'm reflecting that. So a couple of additional resources that I want to share with you. There's some resources for creating metaphors. There's some more resources for challenging conversations, if that's something that you may particularly struggle with. And Uncommon Schools, Teach Like a Champion. This third one is a book that I read when I was going through my teacher training program. And even though it's geared more towards elementary, primary school, it is something that can help you to get some of these key strategies for becoming a better trainer, if that's what you would like. And if anyone wants to read about some structuralism, Ferdinand de Saussure is there, Course in General Linguistics from 1916. If you do read that, please let me know. And just as we're finally wrapping up here, I just want to go back to him again, his quote that a language is a system in which all the elements fit together and in which the value of any one element depends on the simultaneous coexistence of all the others. So with this talk, we called it Improving Communication Skills. And what I hope you take away from this is that just as the concept of language is very complex, so is the approach that you're going to need to take when you are improving your communication. You break it down into smaller pieces. You take it one step at a time, and then as you move forward and become better at it, that's the way that you're able to put the pieces back together. Thank you.